Hi, my name is Dung Ngo. I'm the editor-in-chief of August Journal. It's a magazine of travel and design, and I'm very thrilled to be asked to host this particular talk from Design Miami Basel on emerging talents in design in Europe and in America. And with me, I have two amazing curators and writers who will be part of the discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Alice Stori Liechtenstein. Alice has an amazing program called the Schloss Hollenegg for design in Austria, which we'll ask her to talk about when she starts her presentation. And secondly, we will have Monica Khemsurov. Monica is one of the two co-founders of Sight Unseen. I like to say that Sight Unseen is the grande dame of the online presentation or platform for emerging design. So this is super exciting. We'll start first with Alice. Hi, Alice. How are you?
Hi, lovely to be here with you. Thank you for this lovely talk.
Of course. So, Alice, I visited your beautiful castle in southern Austria. Maybe was it 2 years ago?
Yes.
During one of your beautiful presentations, where you show the work that you invited the designers to come and produce and present. Tell us a little bit more about Schloss Hollenegg for design.
So the program was founded in 2015. And we started with the opportunity of offering emerging designers a residency in the castle. What's very special about the place is that it goes through approximately 800 years of history and art, and all the rooms are packed with objects of art, craft, of all different kind of values. So not everything is amazing, but everything is highly inspiring. And the idea was to invite the designers and get them to work in such an environment and commission them pieces that would fit within the history of the context and the history of the place, but could also be a research in their own practice and could live outside of the place. And that then developed into a yearly exhibition. So we've had now our 6th year. And we've had, over these 6 years, we had over 20 designers, 25 designers in residence, and we've had over 100 designers showing in the yearly exhibition. And most of them are under 35. They are so-called emerging in the sense that they might have had some experience, some early success, but are still in a kind of developing phase. And The idea of the program is to really give them a platform and give them visibility, but also to mentor them, give them a bit of input, maybe push them in a due direction, make them do things that they wouldn't feel necessarily comfortable to do in a more commercial environment.
Got it. And each of your exhibition is thematic. Is that correct?
Yes. So we've had very wide themes in the first 5 years. We've talked about slowness. We've talked about change. We've talked about legacy. The exhibition that you came and see was Ad Mensam, which was all about table rituals, the conversations that happen at the table. So there were obviously furniture such as tables, but also table objects or conversation pieces. This year, we had an exhibition which was a little bit different from the past ones. It was all about ceramics. So it was called Earth and Fire. And we really paired new objects with historical objects. And it was an excuse to tell short stories about how ceramics are made, what have been the developments, what's fascinating about this medium, which has always been considered more of a kind of craft. It's always been a little bit considered on the side, on the margins, and now it's fighting to get a proper standing and fighting to be considered art or design, depending on who makes it.
Got it. The pictures of the exhibition is amazing, and I wish I could have seen it in person, but maybe next year. So next year. I'm super excited then to see your selection of a handful of young designers that you feel is the next wave.
Yeah, so very happy. I'll share my screen. So this is Schloss Hollenegg, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the context in which I'm working. I've put together a few
Actually,
slides.
Alice, can I ask you a quick question? Just for, in the interest of full disclosure, how did you end up living in Schloss Hollenegg?
Well, that's a good question. It's called love. I married an Austrian almost 20 years ago. And I fought against living in a castle for 11 years. And after 11 years, I gave up and I decided, okay, now I can speak German. My kids are at school. I can manage a castle as well. And that's when we decided to move. And actually the reason why I started the program was because I felt if I'm going to live in this place, I need to make it mine in a way, like feel that I'm here because I'm doing something with it rather than, you know, the famous words, I only moved here because of you. So now my husband says, well, I'm only in Hollenegg because you have a program here. So
great. That's great.
It's been a really interesting journey opening up the place and giving it new, fresh light. So here we have, for example, 2 images of the exhibition we were talking about, Earth and Fire. So you can see the historical objects and the contemporary objects. We have a blue and white vase, which is 3D printed by Babette Witzerok. And we have a stool in very strong colored glazing by Ronaldo Sanguigno. This slide is a table by Bredet Escalop. They're Austrian designers. Here we have an installation by Nel Verbeke and a rug by Odd Matter. So again, you can see here how the objects really kind of are in dialogue with the rooms they're made for. But you can possibly imagine also the rug in your living room. So it's always important that they live outside of the context of the castle as well. And here we start with one of my first emerging talents. This is Thomas Balouet. He's a graduate of Design Academy. He's currently living in Paris, France. And he has a very kind of rough aesthetic and a very DIY approach to design. So he makes most of the projects himself. And they have this kind of, this is a kind of object to be hanging on the wall where you have different plugs and different lighting, and you have a little shell, and you can imagine adding your coffee somewhere. So it's a kind of working station for the wall. The image that we saw before, this is a shelf, and it's all made out of aluminium. So it's cut and folded aluminium. This is a mirror he's done for a show at Friedman Bender, which I curated back in January. So there's a little mirror, and then there's a shelf, and there's to hang your towels. This is a kind of like fantasy world. Yeah, you can imagine this being in some kind of cartoon or in a kind of doll's house. So this kind of creating a kind of parallel world where anything can be made out of plastilene kind of thing. And again, these are, again, metal objects, table and stools. They have this feel of being totally fragile and wobbly. And in fact, they're incredibly stable. And I always find it really interesting because he's very keen on doing things himself. So there's always this contrast between what he can make and what his design wants. And it's always this kind of reaching further and getting better at making things, but always having the limit of the material, which I find very interesting. This is Arnaud Eubelin. He's a Belgian designer. He doesn't have a kind of formal education in design. And this looks like a very sleek object. And in fact, it's all made out of found materials, mostly from construction. And you can see it in these further images as well. It's all repurposed things. So his approach is very much about rewiring, reshaping, reusing. And I think it's interesting because this upcycling, it's something that, you know, we always have in the back of our mind. But then when we see things which are upcycled, they always look very kind of cheap or very kind of hobby, with a hobby feel to it. And these are objects that you just would never even imagine calling upcycling. So I think he really has mastered the technique exceptionally well. These are more experimental chairs, but again, everything is found objects. Everything it's a bit of a modern take on the ready-made as well, which I think is interesting. And these are some of his latest works. And when I saw these, I was like, wow, he's really on a mission. I think there's a huge development in his work since a couple of years ago when I first saw him at Collectible Fair in Brussels. So he's going on larger, bigger things. What I also find interesting is that he regularly dismantles things that he has already made because he needs to make new ones. And sometimes he doesn't find the material. So he just says, I'll just reuse that. So it's a kind of, you can get the idea that, if I don't like the chandelier, I can go back to him in a year time and say, hey, I don't know, make me a chair or make me something else. Here we have Schimmele and Schweikel. This is a project that they did for a gallery in Antwerp, Everyday Gallery. And these objects are all made out of wood. And what's interesting is that some of them are handmade and some of them are 3D made. So there's this kind of questioning the hierarchy. Yeah? There's a lot of talk about craft right now and limited editions. And there's a feel that anything which is industrially produced, it's not of the same quality as craft. Craft is having a really strong revival. And here they're just kind of saying, well, actually it doesn't really matter. Can you tell what is craft? Can you tell what is handmade? Can you tell what is industrial? What's 3D printed? And I think they have a very particular aesthetic. They are extremely influenced by 3D modeling and, sorry, I went too far. By 3D modeling and computer technology. They are students of Design Academy as well. But they are now back in Germany, if I'm not mistaken. So it's also interesting to see how, for example, designers are choosing not anymore to be in few centers, but they're also quite happy to live where they come from and go back home, and especially in this last year and a half. The next designer is Charlotte Kingsnorth. She's an alumni of Royal College of Art, and she lives in London. And the project which I find most interesting of hers is these chairs. And again, it's this idea of repurposing old chairs and giving them a kind of new life and doing the upholstery. Again, here's a designer that makes most of the work herself. So she's very hands-on building the things. And she has this kind of very strong, every chair has this really strong personality. And I think that's something which is, fascinating. You can just imagine, saying, hey, the chair has to be for me. How do you see it? And she will be coming to Hollenegg very soon. And that's exactly the kind of work that I wanted to do, is like find two chairs, find the fabric, whatever we have on offer, and let's see what comes out that actually has a conversation with the place. So here are two more examples. And again, it's like, this is not what you would normally call upcycling, because the quality is so high and there's a real vision to it. And my last designer is Saelio Aparicio. She's actually an artist. Her sister is Atua Aparicio, who's known as a designer. And Saelio she studied fine arts in Spain, where she's from, and then studied at the Royal College of Art, but she studied sculpture. And these are her first examples of furniture. And I think it's interesting to see how there are several artists which are working with furniture, and they're interpreting, the stool, the chair, the wardrobe, and using them as they were their canvases, but you can actually use them. So I think there really is a kind of conversation going on between the two disciplines, and it's just interesting to see a very different approach to something which is a piece of furniture. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation today.
Absolutely amazing. The range is quite wide and quite interesting, and I already have 1,000 questions for you, but I'm going to save them until after Monica's presentation.
Perfect.
Hi, Monica.
Hello, hi guys.
Hi, how are you?
To be here.
So I understand you are actually calling in from Berlin, is that right?
Yes, I relocated to Berlin from New York in November, and I've been living here ever since. I think in the future I might go back to being half New York, half Berlin, but I'm not sure. For now, I just thought COVID was a good excuse to get a change of scenery.
It's a very good excuse. I'm super jealous.
Yeah.
So I feel like Sight Unseen for me has been around forever. I can't think of a time that Sight Unseen has not been around, but obviously that's not true. So tell us a little bit about Sight Unseen for those who don't know.
Yeah, so well, before there was Sight Unseen, myself and Jill, who is my co-founder of Sight Unseen, we worked together at the design magazine ID. So I think through working together at ID and through, working at this small magazine where we had like a lot of freedom and a lot of kind of leeway, and we were learning things and figuring out what was interesting to us. Like we kind of, when we left, we took this idea of like seeing the stories behind the products, or the stories of people who made them, or like delving into how things are made or what materials they're made with. That was always what kind of interested us the most at ID. So we started Sight Unseen in order to like explore these kind of backstories and these more process-oriented stories behind these objects. And it's evolved obviously beyond that. Now I think people see it also as a source of, information on new talents and new trends, and kind of just like try, if you want to like stay at the cutting edge of contemporary design, like we're a good place to kind of scout things.
That's the reputation, and this is why we're super excited to have you to be part of this presentation. Just before we go into your presentation, what year was it that Sight Unseen was founded?
It was 2009. 2009,
okay.
Yeah.
It's a teenager.
Yes, it is.
There we go, right. So we're excited for your presentation.
Okay, so the one thing that I wanted to mention is it's funny, like we're using the word emerging designers in this talk, but Jill and I actually kind of have moved away from that word a little bit, and we talk a lot about independent designers. And we do that because it's so hard to tell like when a designer is emerging versus when they've emerged. I think the playing field in design has gotten so broad and like so populated that it's a little less obvious, like when someone's, or even, I would say even relevant when someone's like, emerging versus mid-career versus famous. I think it's just kind of like a big melting pot now. And so we tend to say independent studio, which means that they're, making things themselves, working for themselves, running their own studio, as kind of a better way to be like a catch-all for the talents that we kind of cover, because that way no one gets offended. It's like, wait, I'm not emerging. Like, I've arrived.
That's a very interesting distinction, and I'd love to talk about all of that in relationship with Alice's designers after your presentation.
Yeah. So with that said, I kind of chose people that are a little bit on a spectrum of being more established to being more new. And I was going to start with the more established talents. And the first one is Eny Lee Parker. And I just had to include her because we have kind of like a fun past with her, which is that when she was in school at SCAD in Savannah, we like just saw her work on Instagram and got really excited about it because it felt kind of like really well resolved and kind of, I guess I would say on trend, although I don't like saying that. But anyway, she seemed like an interesting person. And so we invited her to show at Sight Unseen Offsite, which is the big showcase of independent designers that we do usually when it's not a pandemic in May during New York Design Week. So we kind of plucked her off of Instagram out of school and had her drive a truck up from Savannah to New York to show her work with us for the first time. And this was her booth at Offsite. And already it was just like, for someone who was in school to come and show this work and this type of presentation was so impressive. And I don't know, we knew she was going to be like a rising star. And now in the States, she's pretty well known. She has a big following, and she's kind of like made it into the slightly more mainstream in terms of the design world. But she comes partially from a ceramics practice, which is why she's interesting. Like she makes furniture and objects. I mean, objects, I should say, not just objects, but furniture based on ceramic pieces, like turning them into a more structural or, main part of the piece. And she's kind of known for this organic look. These lamps are kind of one of her more known pieces, and you'll see them, in a lot of homes of people who have good taste or who are influencers. This is kind of like her hot piece or whatever. And this is like a table and a stool, so you can see kind of how she uses ceramics on a larger scale and beyond kind of the obvious scale. That said, she does work in other materials. These all are sort of more in her ceramics practice, but she also makes mirrors that you see here, and she's working now. Her next projects are going to be in glass, which I think is exciting, because she does have this like very specific aesthetic, and so it'll be interesting to see what she does when she does her like handmade glass in that dialogue. And also she was born in Brazil, which is a fun fact. Born and raised in Brazil. So she now lives in New York. And next is Sam Stewart. And Sam actually studied math and philosophy in school. So he was not trained as a designer. And I read this story where he said he was sort of inspired by a friend of his father's who was a cabinet maker. And he was like fascinated by this like woodworking that this guy did. And he was like, well, why is everything so, folksy? Why can't I make something new or something different? And when he graduated school, he started working as an art handler in Chelsea and was exposed to this like sort of contemporary design and art world. And then he started making his own work. And he's from North Carolina, he's from North Carolina, but now he's kind of considered like a quintessential like New York designer. He got well known by making tables for this like really popular restaurant called Dimes, and then he kind of just started expanding his work from there. And what I like about his work is that he can have this like very formal precision, and he can work with materials in kind of a more minimalist way, but then he has these kind of weird shapes and bold colors, and sometimes even these like cartoonish forms, where he kind of takes it outside of this kind of simplicity. So, and also these lights are inspired by New York infrastructure, like street vents and standpipes, things like that. So there's like a very like New York element to his work. And also there's like a little bit of this like Italian, like postmodern or pop sensibility as well. So I like this sort of mix of simplicity and fun that he has in his work. Okay, so Ian Felton, he's from Washington, DC. He lives in New York as well. And we just kind of fell in love with his first collection of furniture, which you see here. And he was interested when he made this collection in pre-Columbian art and fertility sculptures. So he kind of like pulled some of these shapes and this like chubby feeling from some of those sculptures and pieces of artwork from the ancient world. But again, it like still looks very contemporary and has like a very familiar feeling, but his reference points are kind of interesting. He, in general, is interested in anthropology and antiquity and, the symbology and architecture of civilizations from the past. So this was his very first collection. He's made a few new pieces since, which you'll see in these slides, but we are kind of waiting to see kind of what he does next. These are still technically part of the same series, and they're made with like Mexican lava stone, and he also uses like Peruvian alpaca. So there's like an interesting connection with the themes that he explores. And this is Min Jae Kim. So Min Jae, I feel, is particularly relevant at this moment because he just had a really strong solo show in Los Angeles at Marta Gallery. And now he kind of, I feel like, is everywhere right now in the States. He's done a few collections with different galleries and different projects, and people are kind of getting very interested in his work. So he grew up in Korea, and he went to architecture school in Columbia. Sorry, not in Columbia, at Columbia in New York. And his practice is pretty interesting. So he kind of comments on the cultural appropriation of Eastern like art and design into Western culture by kind of creating like a reverse appropriation. So he creates his own version of Western culture through his eyes, which, you know, obviously are somewhat of an outsider. He's you know, Korean and American at this point, but he kind of takes his own viewpoint on sort of classical Western design. So he did from the show at Marta, and he made this table based on like Matisse cutouts, and he made chairs based on apparently Freud's office chairs, which I guess is like this one as well. So he's kind of putting it through his own lens, or putting his own spin on it. And this piece is interesting because he has developed his own technique of working with fiberglass, where he stitches it and almost like quilts layers of it together and then like coats it in resin. So he's also working on developing like his own techniques, which I thought was interesting. So here are some more of the forms. The piece on the left is from the Marta show, and the piece on the right is from his, I think, his first collection, but he's kind of having a moment right now. And I love it because I don't usually find myself drawn to these more rustic materials and forms, but I think his formal language is so interesting, and he also like knows how to kind of play with it. And, you know, he like these lamps, which are really silly, but in a kind of really sophisticated way. And I like that kind of balance of the two perspectives. Okay, so then my last two are designers that I actually don't know as much about. They're sort of more newcomers to me, but I wanted to include two designers that we're kind of excited to see more from or to learn more about. And one of them is Nefemi Ogunro, and she's also a New Yorker. She was born in France, and she lives in Brooklyn. And I just learned about her work recently, and I just like her work because I think she just has like some of these other designers I've talked about, has really good taste. And I feel like that when I see a designer who's making various forms and working with different materials, yet they're all united by the sense of like good taste or like a good sense of style, like that's kind of when I think they might go on to do big things, because you can tell that their aesthetic is kind of consistent. Not the best photo here, but you can see some of the furniture pieces she made, which all have kind of a different formal language, but they're all actually inspired by members of her family. Like she used family members as inspiration points for how to think about these pieces, which I think is a more abstract process. It's not like one-to-one, but that's kind of the story behind these works. Sorry, another not great photo. But I also, you know, obviously I'm interested in her work as well, because she has stated that she wants to help like create a safe space for voices in design that, you know, have traditionally or recently been excluded. And I think that's so important. And so it's really nice to see someone who's like super on the level and making amazing work, who also, you know, wants to bring diversity to the design world, and also be a model or a, you know, for an inclusion, I guess. So that's her. And then this is Nicholas Bijan Pourfard. And I also don't know too much about his work, but he is just making such beautiful things. And he just started recently. He actually was making guitars. I believe he still is, but he started designing these guitars out of old used skateboards. And that was the first thing he did out of school. And he was like using like woodworking techniques with these like recycled skateboard pieces. And he kind of from there transitioned into making furniture and lighting. So, and like this piece, I really love this table because the base of it is just so interesting. Like I think it's like such a beautiful form and shape that he uses, and his perspective is really interesting. And he also, I like that he works equally well when he's doing these organic soft forms as when he's doing these like really rigid linear forms, which again speaks to like a diversity of perspective that I think often foreshadows someone, you know, having a good career, I guess. He's based in San Diego, and he's kind of more like an industrial designer where he's interested in like process and precision and joinery and all these things. But I think his work is quite nice.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I love the work. It's quite super fresh, if that's the right word. And Monica, I really appreciate your mention about the difference between, let's say, emerging and independent. And you're absolutely correct that, you know, it's hard to say what does emerge or establish mean. And of all the designers that you both showed me, the ones that caught my eye just initially are the ones who are actually not just not established, but not even from the establishment, meaning they were not trained as designers. Monica, you showed someone who was trained as a scientist, someone who was trained as an architect, and then a third person, I think, has some other background. So what's your thought on that, Monica? Is this a new trend, or is this something that we're just noticing now?
Well, I don't know if it's a new trend per se, but I do think that the period we're living in, it makes it much easier because I feel that there is such a focus right now on, you know, on basically people having a lot of freedom creatively and being able to make things that aren't necessarily just for commercial production. People can make things that are for galleries or for commission, and that kind of opens up the possibilities of, you know, not having to be formally trained in all of these design techniques that maybe before you like really, in order to make a career, to make money, like you had to be able to create things that could be produced by a factory, or that, you know, even to know how to make things in a certain way, which now, you know, designers are able to like experiment in their studio, like mad scientists, you know, just creating materials and stuff. So it makes it easier not to have the formal background. So I think that if it's not more common now, it may be, you know, in the near future, just because there's more of an open door for that type of outsider education.
Yeah. And you mentioned someone attending SCAD. I think it was Eny Lee Parker.
Actually, Eny and also Ian did as well.
Oh, okay. So that's definitely one of the major design schools in the US. You did not present anyone from RISD, which is where somehow like the last couple of generations of designers have come from. So I want to go over to the idea of education in Europe. And Alice, you presented a few designers from the Design Academy, or as we call it here at Eindhoven, you know, the famous design school in the Netherlands. Is that still sort of the place to be? What's the scene for education in design in Europe right now?
I mean, I think Design Academy and the Royal College of Art in London are still very much the kind of, an ECAL maybe in Lausanne for a little bit more luxury-oriented product design. I think they're still very good schools, very well renowned. So if you have attended and come out, you know what you're doing. Yeah, usually. Because there's a very strict selection, because the process, you know, they kind of like really push you. So I think you can call yourself a qualified designer if you come out of these schools. But it's true what Monica says about maybe being it a little bit easier right now, not to have had a kind of very classic or academic education. So there are I think there are more designers just ending up being designers through other routes. And also what I find interesting is right now, I see a lot of designers emerging from Germany, which seems to be like up and coming. And there's a university design and art university in Karlsruhe, which is gaining kind of momentum, and it's clearly doing a really good job at giving a kind of open and diverse education in terms of design and art. So I'm curious that this is definitely one of the top trips that I'm planning to do before the end of the year, COVID allowing, is definitely go to Germany and check out what's happening in Karlsruhe, because I think it's interesting.
We eagerly await that report from
yes.
you, for sure. What do you think, Alice, is enabling non-designers to be aware of design and to think that they can do it? Is it, could it be just the accessibility of contemporary design on the internet?
I mean, I definitely think design is something that people are much more aware now than they were, just 10 years ago, or maybe even just 6 years ago. So I think, I mean, I noticed it because I was at a dinner party last night, and suddenly it was like everyone was talking about design, and I was in a crowd of totally non-design people, and they were asking questions, and it was like, okay, this is like, a little bit more mainstream than it would have been some years back. So I think that's definitely it. People are aware that there are independent designers, as Monica rightly says, working for themselves and making things. I think there's also a kind of preference right now for things which have a very handmade feel to them, which have this kind of touch, and they have a kind of, a real tactile feeling. And those obviously are pieces which are handmade, and that's totally acceptable. There's, I think in both Monica's and my selection, there's a lot of designers which actually make things themselves. And I think that's something that even if you don't have, the technical knowledge, the background, you start making, and eventually you get good at it, and eventually your things will, appear in magazines and get sold. So I think that also probably facilitates, is this kind of taste and preference for things which have a real handmade feel to them.
Right.
I can add something as well, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Which is, obviously when the question you asked, everyone would think, okay, Instagram is exposing all these people to design and like making them think that they can do it. But I think also it's not just Instagram, but it's sort of, and we're hyper aware of it because Sight Unseen was kind of founded on the idea of looking behind the scenes of things. But it's also that people are sharing their techniques on Instagram and on, and on the web, and like showing how things are made and showing the experiments they're doing in their studios. And I think that's also exposing people to like technique and making more. And it's kind of like making it less mysterious or like rarefied and kind of more down to earth. And maybe that's got something to do with it.
I think you've hit a really good point. I think there's a lot of tutorials. I mean, obviously my kids, for example, they grow up in a kind of like very creative environment. Yeah. But suddenly both of them were making side tables, and not because they had the designers, but because they went on a tutorial and followed a YouTube tutorial on how to make a little side table. So, I mean, that's something like teenagers, they feel confident that they can, see online how it's done and put together two pieces of wood. So I think that's kind of, it's definitely the internet, but it's a sharing of technique, which I think is super interesting that you mentioned. I hadn't.
Well, this brings up for me a really interesting question, which is the question of tradition or local heritage. If you're learning how to make a chair on YouTube or on Instagram, or how to produce a certain technique through the internet, is there traditions, that local traditions that you notice from your designers anymore, or have we gone global in a particular way? Monica, for instance, I think you have one of your designers were using New York motifs, which I thought was pretty interesting. But the look and feel is more, like you said, it was more Italian. The final product was more postmodern in a certain way. Right. Are there such a thing as a New York designer anymore?
I wouldn't say there's such a thing as a New York designer, no. But I do think that designers now are still very aware of both like using their identity in their work, the same way that happens in art now. And also I think that, the same way that globalism kind of removes all the borders. It also makes people more aware of these traditions in other places. And I'm not saying people are like appropriating traditions from other places, but there are like certain ways of making and certain techniques that people become interested in that, you know, maybe they're not making it in the place that it's from, but I think that there still is like an interest in the revival of some of these old traditions or crafts. And some of the people are making it in their own place of birth, I think. But I think there's still a huge amount of interest in that. I mean, a lot of like the designers working in Mexico, for example, are very focused on working with Mexican craftspeople and indigenous materials and, you know, like artisans, you know, outside of these major metropolises. Anyway, so I think that both things kind of come hand in hand. Like the globalism makes people even more aware of like how to, you know, honor their own heritage, but also, yeah, I don't think there is a New York design style. So, you know, it's Europe and New York have kind of gone like this, you know.
There we go.
I think you're absolutely. Sorry, I just wanted to add. I think in terms of style, it's very hard to say nowadays where something, you know, it's Scandinavian, Italian, you know, American, South American. I think what it's linked is to the craftsmen who might be helping, you know, to these kind of techniques. So then, I mean, there is a lot of design coming out of there's a lot of interest for design and crafts in Mexico at the moment, as Monica was saying, and obviously a lot of it you can recognize it because it's based on this tradition.
Right. So I have to admit that if I didn't know who was presenting whom, I would have a hard time choosing to say which designer is European and which one was American with the work that you presented. There's, I think part of it is there's a lot of commonalities between the two bodies of work collectively. And I think the biggest thing that I noticed is that you both brought up this handmade quality, this sort of rough sort of production, you know. And Monica, you one of your definitions for independent designer is that they make the products themselves, which I find also really interesting. Obviously, that's out of necessity. They don't have access to the kind of machinery or production techniques that, you know, bigger manufacturers have, but it's obviously also very much chosen. Can you guys both talk about that a little bit, what you see in that work and why this personal handmade expression? Alice, I think a lot of your designers have this.
Yeah. Well, I think this handmade approach is a bit of a reaction to all the time that we spend on technology, actually. So I think there's this need to be again in contact with physical things and this need to experiment with you know, something that you're making yourself. I think that's definitely an element, you know. Also that like there's a great rise in textiles and rugs, and so that's also, I think it's a kind of like balancing out the amount of time that we spend on very smooth surfaces and you know, in a kind of surreal digital world. On the other hand, I think it's because a lot of the handmade is just cheaper to make. I mean, you know, the times when companies were willing to invest time and resources on designers and get them to experiment are very, very long gone. So for a lot of designers, you know, appropriation of used materials, reusing, repurposing, making themselves, using clay, these are all very important things because they just cannot afford to make design pieces in any other way, at least to start with, yeah. And then obviously it becomes a part of their identity, a part of their style. So then, you know, they get good at it and then they keep going. And I think it's interesting because there's a lot of designers that have this kind of very rough aesthetic because they clearly started off with, you know, whatever they had in their studio. And then you see, and then when you look closely, the quality is amazing, you know, and it's kind of the details are perfect. The object is stable. It's just really well made. It just looks like it's a kind of like mashed up. Yeah. And I always find that that's so fascinating because actually you look at it and it's like, wow. And that's because they've become good at what they're doing. You know, they started off with leftovers And then actually, they just get really good at putting the leftovers together, and they just stick with this kind of working method. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Monica, what do you think about it?
Well, I agree with everything you said, and I thought it was very insightful. And I also wanted to then be the cynical point of view, just bring up just a little bit and say that you also, I think, at least from my point of view, I think it's important to acknowledge the market as well as a factor here, because I think that there's a couple of things. So first of all, designers, so when designers are working for companies, obviously their salary was paid or whatever, it was a different kind of thing. But when you're working for yourself, you have to figure out how to make a living. And I think that the sort of aspirational way of making a living now would be one of two things, which would be showing with like a gallery and selling your pieces to collectors, or selling your pieces to like interior designers for like custom commissions and stuff like this. So the two things that I was thinking is, number one, part of this like handmade, wacky, like put these things together, it looks really lumpy kind of thing, is I think partly because that's what art collectors kind of want. Yeah. And when an art collector is buying design, they want something that looks artistic or weird or like handmade, because it's sort of this like value perception thing somehow. And so I think that's having an influence. And the other thing is that when I was watching your selections versus mine, I was like, oh, hers have a much more like conceptual or, gallery feel in some ways, and mine feel more just like pretty furniture. And I think that like that's related to the fact that in the US, the biggest market right now is interior designers.
Yeah. But it has also a lot to do with, I think you're right, but I think it's also a lot to do with the schools. Like I try and get the designers. I think it's great that they have this kind of very conceptual approach as they come out of university and the design schools. But I struggle with that, because sometimes it's like, guys, you can still be conceptual and it could still work, So yeah. I think that's something which is important to remind them every so often. Yeah, it's nice to actually sit on the chair. But we don't have such a strong interior design market. I think that's probably.
Yeah, and you guys have a much stronger gallery market than us.
Yeah.
So,
what this brings up for me is this idea of the question of the implications of handmade versus mass production in terms of both, goals as well as actual reality of producing something that can be mass produced. Something that's handmade will be very, very difficult to mass produce in higher quantities, even if, you're going over 100 or 200 units, which is nothing, right? But most of the pieces that you're presenting are produced as one-offs or maybe a couple of pieces. What do you see is the future for this particular kind of production? Are we going to go back to kind of a very handcrafted market, or war of design, or will there be a parallel track where people are producing casina and then people are producing for direct to consumer or to the gallery market?
Well, yeah. I think there's more realities that can coexist in parallel. I think what I see a lot is, I'm not talking about very industrial products, obviously, but, the kind of mid-range. So let's say rugs or, upholstery. So what happens is that a lot of companies that need designers which already have a name. So they might first wait for a designer to establish themselves. And then when they see that it's a good designer, then they might decide, okay, let's give them a chance and let's try and get them to do a product. And that's a part that's at the moment, for example, that's a big part of my day-to-day job as well, is finding designers which are suitable for different companies. They might not be very big ones. They might need someone who's capable of doing it, but not super famous yet. And then it's a question of doing some fun matchmaking. And but again, the designers need to understand how a company works, and not all of them are able to do the jump. So I think that's what I always tell the designers I work with, is like, keep all your options open, be precise enough and be technical enough that you can work with a company if you get the opportunity, but do try and carry on experimenting and doing your own work, because that's what the press is interested in. That's what Instagram is interested in. So that's how you're going to get the visibility. I don't think it's a question of one or the other. I think it's just a question of having as many options. It's like in fashion, you don't have the mini skirt or the long skirt anymore. You wear one on one day and one on the other day,
Right. Okay. Monica, what were your thoughts on the future of the one-off or the independent design?
It's funny because I'm a little bit of a baby with this stuff, and I'm like, I don't want to talk about commerce. It's like, there's some part of our job where it's like we want to believe we're just in this like creative thinking world, and then it's like, if I stop and think like, oh, what am I doing? I'm just selling expensive shit to rich people. I get like, I'm like, I don't know. Yeah. So I tend to have like a little bit of blinders on with that stuff on purpose to stay sane. But I would say, I don't know. I don't want design to become this thing where it's like all the designers are trying to make the most expensive thing to sell at the best salary to the, for people that can afford it. So I do think that I hope that there, is a nice balance between mass production and handmade, and I hope we can find it. I think that the problem is it just depends on things that are so much bigger than design, like global production and, where you're outsourcing your production to and what the minimums are and all these things and who has access to that. But from a purely idealistic standpoint, like obviously manufactured stuff is more democratic and it reaches more people, and that's always going to be like somewhat, of an ideal. But I don't know how those things are going to reconcile in the future, to be honest.
Yeah. I think especially, the current situation obviously has exacerbated that because, with the delivery and the fact that, a lot of, even just the Suez Canal being stuck, that has shown how we're so dependent on things being carried from one side to the other. And I think that there's definitely going to be a change in the way things are produced. And I think, especially in terms of design, I don't think that the industrial production is ever going to be what it used to be. So there have to be kind of new ways of going into production and new ways of doing things.
So Alice, I can't be in agreement with you more on that. And I think especially what you said that for a designer to sort of make these different steps to go from independent to working with small manufacturers and producer to bigger manufacturers, the first step is to get their attention. And I just cannot think of two more platforms that has given young designers so much attention and so much credit and show off their work as Schloss, Hollenegg, and Sightseeing. So I want to thank you both for those incredible jobs that you guys have done in the past 12 plus years now. And I also would like to thank you for participating in this talk. This was super amazing. I learned so much. And I hope to see you both in person really soon.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Design Miami. It was great to speak with you guys today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a great opportunity to see you and be together. So thank you from my side too.
Great. Hopefully next time in person.
Yes, that'd be nice.
Bye.